Hi everybody, Nam here, and welcome to another episode of NamNotes, where today we're going to be talking about vibe coding. Yes, vibe coding. Vibe coding is a concept in which someone, whether you are a software developer or not, uses generative AI to create code so that you don't necessarily have to. Now, for people who are not programmers, software developers, or software engineers, that is something that can open a door for them to create something that they wouldn't have normally been able to create in the past. Disclosure, I am a software developer, and I would be a software engineer if I had a job, but I digress. First things first, I needed to decide how to write my app. I was thinking I could do this in Visual Studio Code. I could do this in Android Studio. Well, do I want to use a language that I already know how to write, or do I want to use a new language so that I could learn something while I'm going through this process? For anybody who knows me, knows that I'm typically in the Microsoft stack for pretty much most of my professional life. I decided I wanted to try something new. I should try something new so that I could learn something, and so I decided to use Android Studio and learn how to write it in Kotlin. When I first started the project, I didn't know anything about Kotlin, and so I decided, let me just figure out how to use it. The problem was I didn't have this understanding of like what libraries existed for what types of functionality. The fact that it would be used for a phone or a device that had a touch screen, what kind of interactions and interface options already existed, basically just lacked the library knowledge of how to go about using whatever best practices were available to me in Kotlin. And so that was one of the biggest things that I did not know. And so I went about starting to create the app basically by just asking the LLM, hey, can you create a basic one screen app for me? And it went ahead and did that. Probably before we get too deep into this, we should probably discuss how I decided on my LLM of choice. First things first, I decided that I needed to use an LLM that was free to me. And so that narrowed down to a bunch of different choices, but there are some free tiers where I would be limited from using the same model, where I would be limited to just X number of prompts. And I didn't want my workflow to stop because of that. I didn't want like the quality of answers to all of a sudden be slightly different, or I'd have to re-explain myself because the model on the back end changed. And so one of the things I decided to do was, let me evaluate the top tier players. All the top tier players either had pretty low limits or I had to pay. And so I decided on using Google Gemini because I could just continue to use the same Gemini model for free and I wouldn't have to pay anything. What I wanted to do if I ended up wanting to work on the project for a long time and needing to prompt a lot. That's one of the major reasons why I decided to just use Gemini. It was already integrated into my workflow, and I was like, well, I'm making an app for the Android Google Play Store, so I was like, all right, let me just use the Google one. It makes perfect sense. Okay, so now I had my LLM of choice. I had my development environment all set up. I ended up starting to dabble in writing certain functions myself and learning things like what a composable is, choosing the difference between XML and Jetpack Compose. Which, by the way, I didn't think that it was a big debate when I was just talking with the LLM about dealing with XML layouts versus Jetpack Compose. And apparently, there was some camp where some people would choose XML layouts over Jetpack Compose. I guess there's a couple of really weird situations where you could use those. I'm making a quick and simple app. It doesn't need to have like real-time feedback. I don't have any sort of like legacy baggage to deal with as far as things already being created with XML layout. Jetpack Compose was like the natural way to go for this app. That's a decision that you had to make going into development for an Android app. That's something that I learned after creating a few functions. It's like, wait, why? And, having no knowledge of what Android development was like. So that's something that the LLM taught me that I needed to know and understand before I had to make a choice. And as it turns out, I'm of camp Compose. If anybody cares, I just want to do the easier thing. I don't want to have to manage like setting text and stuff the old way. Not that I know what it's like the old way in an Android app, but I've done web pages where just working with JavaScript and it's like, you have to do this and then it will update the thing. And I'm like, oh, so I have to explicitly tell it to update? Yes. I end up creating several pages for the app. Now, for those of you who don't know, the app is basically like a flashcards app, and I intended to create it for the use of parents and other adults who want to use it as a tool to help young kids learn how to recognize letters and words so that they can start reading more quickly. If you listen to my hyperlexia episode, I explain this a little bit more from the perspective of how I got inspired to start doing this in the first place. I actually realized that I could use the app to help my kid learn how to read better, and I'm happy to report that I've used the app on my kid, and she is learning how to read really well, so I'm really happy with the results. I got to a point where I felt like, hey, I have like really basic MVP functionality. And so I was able to scroll through words. I could have separate word lists. And then I decided to make a change that required me to do an architectural change because I wanted something to affect everything. Now, up until this point, because I had just been vibe coding, a lot of it was copy and paste, run the thing, try it in Android Studio, see if it worked. I was code reviewing everything I pasted because I'm like, I need to understand this. One of the first weaknesses of vibe coding occurred to me after getting this very basic MVP. And I was like, how does one maintain this spaghetti code? Because now I'm looking to make a change that will affect everything. And none of it was really created necessarily with having everything else in mind. So overall, it's generally poorly architected. And of course, when you're vibe coding, unless you have that thought consciously ahead of time, you're probably not going to prompt your LLM to architect it well for you as well. And so I was like, oh crap, how do I do this? And so I'm like, I came to this conclusion where I have to refactor the whole thing. And so here I was, all of the code in one file, and I decided, all right, I have to refactor the whole thing, and I immediately broke it up into like 4 or 5 files, breaking everything up into separation of concerns, different parts of the app that make sense together. First of all, just for maintainability, because I'm going to be the sole maintainer of this app, and so I figured I need to make life easier for me. There is one weakness of vibe coding. Another weakness of vibe coding, which I noticed after this point because I started making changes and I did not tell or consult the LLM afterwards. And I was like, hey, I need this, that, and the other thing. And each time something would come back, it would either have like old code, old context, using like variable names that I had already changed. And I'm just like, ugh. So in order to keep the context, you basically have to supply the new version of what you were talking about every time. And so that is something that got super annoying with, in this case, a free LLM that is not integrated into an IDE. I had the opportunity to use Copilot with Visual Studio at my last workplace, and that was super nice just because anytime it would make a suggestion, it would use whatever was there as opposed to what it knew was the last quote unquote snapshot of what you had sent to it. And so here I was kind of half struggling with, all right, I kind of know what I'm doing, I'm making changes on my own now, and the LLM is trying to revert changes on me basically. And so I decided, all right, now from now on, if I need any actual stuff, I'm going to have to piecemeal it myself. So when it comes back with a suggestion, I am not going to copy and paste because it might be too much work. I'm just going to take a chunk that I need and then make sure that it works with my app the way that I want it to. So here I am at this point, and I've vibe coded up until a point where I realized I needed to refactor and architect the thing. Then I'm making changes, and for the most part, I've gotten to a point where, all right, I kind of understand what's going on. I can make changes on my own. Let's do some real testing. And I find a ton of bugs, and the fact that it's kind of a new development environment for me, a situation where I started consulting the LLM as though I was just doing work and I just needed its help. By the way, all of this took place across basically 3 days. I was super happy with like a very basic MVP with like one round of testing in the first 3 days. Now at this point, I was doing this testing and I found several issues. There were a bunch of things that I was like, oh, okay, I think I know what the problem is and I know how to fix it. But wait, I do want to test how good the LLM is at debugging code. I told it, hey, this is the issue, this is the result, here's the error message. Can you tell me what's wrong? And I will say that for almost all of the issues, it came back with at least a correct diagnosis and a proper course of action to fix the thing. The one thing that it did not really come back with as a good fix was it tried to do something way too convoluted for when I was trying to make sure that I have multiple ways to scroll through words. You can either swipe on the screen or press buttons. I just wanted to have the same functionality for both of those, and the LLM just kept on wanting to create a carousel, and I'm like, but the buttons don't really work that well with the carousel the way that I chose to change them. So the LLM basically had to be goaded, as GOAD, not GOAT, just to specify, because that has a different meaning now. I can't just say the word goat and not have it just mean the animal. This is the life in which we live now on the internet. Yeah, I ended up having to goad Gemini into being like, I really want to do this my way, and I don't like your way, so please do it my way. And Gemini was like, okay, all right, here's how you would do it your way. I'm like, all right, thanks. I actually verbally spoke out loud to it because sometimes when I got super frustrated, I would complain about Gemini out loud. Now, this isn't to say that it wasn't very helpful. Like, Gemini for vibe coding was very helpful. I didn't hit any limits. I worked on it for, like, I think one day, like, for 8 hours, which was basically a full work day. I was on a roll that day, and I was, like, very motivated to just keep on going that day. So I was just like, all right, I just keep on doing this. There we are. All right, so at the end of the 3 days, I had a basic MVP. I ended up learning how to package it up and creating APKs, and I learned how to create AABs, which is the Google Play Store app format, which I'll talk more about because I plan on making another episode about going through the process of getting an app into the App Store. And I'm happy to announce that this app is now available in the Android App Store, or sorry, the Google Play App Store. One of the reasons why I wanted to create this, because other people might get some insight or usefulness, or just wanted to hear about my experience. I know I didn't really go too in depth, but I just wanted to get my thoughts down as far as like initial thoughts about vibe coding and what it can be used for, and like its weaknesses based on like one small project. Now, I can imagine that the fact that this was a small project and everything was easy to keep in my head after the fact, but like for large projects, for a huge corporation, this is probably not going to be a great architect for you. You'll probably still need software architects. You'll still need good developers that will look at the big picture and be able to analyze and see, oh, this will be a problem with this code. So overall, vibe coding, I would say the tools are great, but you have to be aware of what weaknesses you're going to have if you choose to use vibe coding. And the thing is, anybody who is very good at double checking themselves and asking an LLM to either double check itself or verify or come up with a better solution or anything like that, you can at least mitigate some of those weaknesses just by your prompting. But at the end of the day, a lot of people's worst enemies using vibe coding is you don't know what you don't know. And that is going to be one of the largest hurdles for anybody who's going to be vibe coding to proceed. The more precise you can be, the better it will be for you while you're using LLMs as a coding assistant. And so overall, I would say my first vibe coding experience for creating something that ended up out in the world, I would say is pretty good. Overall, we did find some weaknesses, but the important thing was that we found out what we didn't know. We found out what it didn't know, the LLM. We were able to get a really fast start. We were able to get to an MVP very quickly with code generated. Anyway, this is probably a lot longer than I wanted it to go anyway. I wanted this to be short, but alas, we have so many stories to tell. So I'm going to go ahead and thank you for listening. Hopefully you guys found this interesting. Hopefully you guys found it useful. Remember to hydrate, stretch, and get good sleep, because as we all know, it's really hard to get good sleep nowadays. And you have a glorious day.